Absolutely absurd. That battle was absurd. Absurd. This is absurd.
Mitch,
That would be absurd. Absolutely absurd.
Absurd. Absurd. This is absurd. This is absurd. This is absurd. Actually absurd.
This is absurd.
It's absurd.
This is absurd. Like, that was absurd.
Just so absurd.
Because they did is pretty absurd. It was absurd. Which is absolutely absurd. Dude, this is absurd. This is absurd. This is absurd. How many
Alright, this is absurd.
really absurd or these absurd crazy races? This is absurd. That was absurd. That's absurd. It's pretty absurd. This is absurd. This absurd. That's absurd. This is absurd though. This was just absurd. Alright, this is absurd. This guy is absurd.
This is absurd.
Pretty absurd. It is absurd. This is absurd. Just absolutely absurd. It's absurd. That is absurd.
God, this is absurd.
It's absolutely absurd. What? That's absurd. This is absurd. Guy, it's absurd. It's absurd. The guy was absurd. This is absurd. This one was absurd.
That's absurd.
This is absurd. Absolutely absurd. This is absurd. Something absurd. Absolutely absurd. Next one is absurd. It's gonna be absurd.
It's just absurd, man. Absurd.
This is absurd. That's pretty absurd. It was absurd.
It's just absurd.
Absurd. From this is absurd. From this is absurd. Be absurd. It's absurd. Absurdly. This is absurd. This is absurd. Absurd. That is absurd. That is absurd. That was actually absurd. Absurd.
Good.
This is absurd.
Absurd.
This is absurd. This is absurd. There's absurd. One of the most absurd.
This
I
is
feel you.
absurd. Absurd.
It's absurd. This is absurd. It's pretty absurd. Absurd. Absurd.
Absurd.
Absurdly.
Absurd.
It's absurd. Really absurd. Just absurd. There's absurd. It's absurd. You absurd.
Ridiculously absurd.
This is absurd. I mean,
Absurd.
Come on, this is absurd.
This is absurd. It's an absurd. This is absurd. Absolutely absurd. Absurd, like absurd amount of